Mastering ought to, your guide to advice modal verbs. Hello, English learners. Today we're going to dive into a special part of the English language that's used a lot when giving or receiving advice. Yes, we're talking about the modal verb, ought to. This can be a bit tricky for learners, but don't worry. We're going to make it easy and fun. To start, let's clarify what we mean by ought to. This phrase is a way to express something that you or someone else should do, usually because it's the right, best, or most advantageous thing to do. It's a bit more formal than should, but less formal than must. Now, let's see how to form sentences with ought to. The general structure is subject plus ought to plus base verb. The base verb is the raw, unaltered form of a verb, such as go, study, eat, etc. For example, you ought to study for the test. Let's move on to some examples. Seeing ought to in context will really help your understanding. 1. Advice about health. You ought to eat more fruits and vegetables. 2. Recommendations about activities. We ought to visit the museum while we're in town. 3. Suggestions for behavior. He ought to apologize for what he said. 4. Opinions on what's expected or supposed to happen. They ought to arrive soon. Notice how all these examples involve some kind of advice or suggestion about what should happen or what someone should do. It's also important to know the negative form, which is ought not to. This is used to advise against doing something. The structure is subject plus ought not to plus base verb. For example, you ought not to skip meals. And that's it for today, folks. Hopefully, you now feel more comfortable using the modal verb ought to. Remember, it's all about expressing advice or recommendations. So go out there and start giving some sage advice in English. Keep practicing and I'll see you in our next lesson. Happy learning!